Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you, babe.
I feel like it's fairly rare for someone to be like a conscious adult when a new word comes into the political lexicon. And I feel like Trumpism is one of those words, even though it is an ism. And a lot of people use it. And I'm just wondering how you define it and sort of how you conceptualize that word and the movement behind it. Because I do think there's sort of a political movement associated with Trumpism.
Yeah, clearly. I think it's if you go back through history, especially modern history, after mass media became a variable, and before, even during the Civil War, the mass media was newspapers.
Mm-hmm. Print media,
and the pulpit, the religious message that was propagated through the pulpit.
Did they distribute pamphlets and materials, or was that mostly like what you hear at Sunday Mass?
Let's go back to the Revolution. Actually, the Revolutionary War, 1774-75, Thomas Paine wrote the famous pamphlet, "Give me liberty or give me death." Mm-hmm. And printing was still such a young space, and it was in paper for printing was expensive, so books were not readily available at all. But some limited newspaper and political pamphlets, were the print media of the day. Then by the Civil War, the printing of books became much more affordable and much more widespread. Mm-hmm. So a book like Uncle Tom's Cabin would have an enormous impact on especially the northern states and their attitude toward slavery. Mm-hmm. Because it was a masterful piece of writing. It just was.
And what a revolution for people to have access to something like that and to be able to read it.
Yep. And there was also newspaper editorials. If you read some of the editorials, both in the North and the South, but especially in the South, the editorial boards really didn't talk about slavery very much. They talked about preserving their sacred way of living, which, of course, was built on the back of slaves.
Right.
And poor whites, actually. Yeah. Indentured servitude was not that far in the distance past. There were lots of whites in the South who were right on the margin of absolute poverty, and they didn't want to compete with black slaves, so they were all for free blacks that would be competing in the marketplace. So slavery was basically okay with them.
Sure.
But the newspapers in the Civil War were really absolutely trumpeting their various causes and really were an accelerant to hostilities. It just got worse and worse and worse. And then some people would argue that the Spanish-American War in 1898 was really created by William Randolph Hearst and his newspaper empire. And remember the Maine, that the Spaniards still owned Cuba, and there was the beginnings of a native insurrection against the Spaniards, but it was not powerful at all. In Spain at that time was kind of a hollowed out empire, but it was in its death throes, right? And William Randolph Hearst owned newspapers on both sides of the United States and in between. And in fact, they called it yellow journalism because it was so inflammatory. And he attributed, so the USS Maine, which was a American battleship, was anchored in Havana Harbor, and it blew up one night. Nobody to this day knows
exactly.
Yeah,
who done it?
Who did it? It could have, very likely it was, if you go back to that, Q bono, who benefits? The Spaniards had no reason to blow up the Maine. They had absolutely they didn't want to antagonize the United States. So it was most likely It was a coal-fired boiler, and probably some sailors got a little too drunk and came back on watch and turned the wrong thing and blew up the fucking Maine. Well, William Randolph Hearst had these bleeding heart headlines all over the United States about remember the Maine. That was the slogan.
Right. That's interesting. I had heard a bit about that story, but I didn't know his involvement or his company's involvement. And even now, when you look at jobs in media, it's like Hearst Publishing or Hearst, I don't know if they call it a corporation, but I would assume that that's that same dynasty, unless that's someone else, and I don't know.
It's the same Hearst that built San Simeon and literally brought a castle from Europe and set it up on the California coast because he was so rich.
Yeah.
He sold so many papers, right? And you have to remember the late 1800s, 1890, up to was the era of the megalomaniac power barons, and they controlled everything. It was the 2% that owned everything back then.
Right.
Then things began to change. In World War II, print journalism was still important, but the radio became increasingly important. Film had some importance, but radio was the soup du jour. And that's why Franklin Delano Roosevelt did his
Fireside chats.
And he had a great manner over the radio, and people would gather around the radio just like people gather around television these days. So
when were individual televisions in family homes predominantly, at least for like middle class Americans? When was that?
Probably black and white television started being present in the American middle class home in the late 50s and in the early 60s.
Okay.
But basically there were 3 channels. There was no public television. There wasn't a lot of live coverage of anything. And there was some really mediocre, crappy I Love Lucy, and
which have become American classics for a lot of people. Yeah.
Yeah, it featured a misogynist pig a
lot of tropes. Yeah.
Yep.
Reflective of the time, I'd say.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. So that was the evolution, and then you know enough about, television became more and more omnipresent. Color television during the Vietnam War, some people would argue that the television coverage of the war in Vietnam did as much as anything else to
help put a stop to the war.
Yeah, unsettle.
Change public opinion.
Yeah, because they saw kids marching in Chicago and getting their ass beat, and they saw a videotape of the National Guard shooting unarmed kids in
Kent State,
right? And they saw during Tet of 68, January of 1968, they saw a tape of the VC trying to overtake the U.S. Embassy in Hue, the old capital where I was about 60 or 70 miles from during this. They saw street-to-street fighting, and it went on for weeks and weeks and weeks, long after the MACV, the military spokespeople in Vietnam, said Tet was a horrendous defeat for the NBA.
Right.
Yeah, weeks later, the Marines are still fighting house to house in Hue, trying to get rid of the NBA.
And that wasn't so much the case during the Korean War? We didn't have similar coverage just based on the time? Or...
Well, there wasn't videotape technology during the Korean War. There was some film, but it was more. There's film during World War II and in the Korean War, but the Korean War started in like 1950 or 51, and television. There were rudimentary black and white televisions in a lot of American homes, but it wasn't omnipresent.
Yeah, it wasn't as effective either, I imagine. It's interesting, too, hearing about, and I mean, I feel like I remember this even, coming of age in the 90s and then becoming aware of like what TV was in the early 2000s, how incredible the leap has been from like Walter Cronkite and a singular late night journalist who you could trust, and everyone tunes into that same news source, and they're really reliable and respectful, and there's no doubting any of that because it was just basic journalism and reporting, to, you know, different networks that have different political priorities, and the ticker tape on the bottom with, you know, consistent breaking news, and everything is sort of, you know, the emphasis is more to sell as opposed to just to give people objective fact and reporting.
Yeah.
And I don't know exactly what like precipitated that change, if it was a change in money or ownership, or if it was just slow and gradual.
It was Rudolph Murdoch.
Rupert Murdoch?
Yeah, he came. He was a yellow print inflammatory publisher in London.
Mm-hmm.
Made a lot of money just publishing all kinds of just off the wall bullshit. You know, a man marries giraffe, you know, that kind of crap.
Oh, so it was like tabloid, real, true bullshit.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, interesting.
But he made so much money at it that he wanted to spread his wings. He was Australian, actually, I believe.
Okay.
And
yeah, I think he was. Or I keep mixing up him and Roger Ailes.
No, well, Murdoch owned the whole thing, and I think Ailes ran it.
Okay.
But Murdoch was just he was he P.T. Barnum of network television. You know, put it out there and they'll believe it, you know.
And was that simply so that he could get money, or were his politics in line? I imagine his politics had to be in line with what Fox News
I think
put
his
out.
money was first and his politics followed right behind it because he could never be wealthy enough. So
yeah.
truth had nothing to do, reliability had nothing to do with it.
Do you remember, as I feel like I sort of think of that change in terms of my media consumption as like pre 9/11 and post 9/11. And I was obviously quite young. I think I was in 6th grade in 2001. But I remember from that point, like the media's role in selling the war, and no one holding that administration accountable really. And like a lot of the facts got lost, and it happened to be, I mean, I'm blocking on the name of the publication. It was a small publication in like middle America that truly were saying, hey, this isn't right, and it's not actually factual. Do you remember, like, was it the early 90s that Murdoch started sort of transitioning, or was 9/11 sort of like a marker event in that as I remember it, or did it happen before?
Well,
Does that make sense?
Yeah. There's this whole tradition in America that if there's a righteous cause for America to defend itself, you as a publishing or broadcasting entity had to get in line. If you didn't get in line, you could get in deep shit really quickly. After the Korean War, Joe McCarthy came along, and he waved this piece of paper in a congressional hearing. He was an alcoholic representative from Wisconsin who lied about being in flying bombers during World War II. He just flat fucking lied about it. I mean, he's just this ballsy drunk con man. And America's always been susceptible to ballsy, dry drunk or drunk con men who just get up and say, oh yeah, the moon's green cheese, and Obama was born in Kenya and blah, blah, and the State Department is riddled with communists. Well, so back in the early mid-50s, there were House on Un-American Activities held hearings, and if they'd haul you in, and if you didn't give up your fellow follower communists, you were just in deep shit. You go to prison, you never work again. There were people who worked as writers. Dalton Trumbo was one of them, right? Who refused to give up the people who had one time been members of the Communist Party. And you have to remember the Communist Party had some reason détente during the Depression because it looked like the end of the world. It looked like Americans were going to starve to death so the richest people could stay rich. I mean, so there's this old tradition when America is seen to be under threat because we lost Korea,
right,
and we lost China to the communists, that you better get in line or you're going to get your ass kicked emotionally, legally, financially, punitively, in a social sense. So that was a lot of what happened around 9/11, and people were unwilling to call out the Bush people.
And arguably it truly was a marker event, because aside from Pearl Harbor, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, there had been no equivalent physical attack on American soil and such significant loss of American life up until that point.
That's exactly correct.
So that changes everything.
Changes everything, and there's some real tragedies in that, because then we launched into this endless war that has cost literally trillions of dollars and tens of thousands of lives, all based upon a lie. And the same Larry Wilkerson, who we saw yesterday on MSNBC, he was Colin Powell's chief of staff when Colin Powell was the Secretary of State during Bush 1. And
Bush 1?
No, I'm sorry, Bush 2.
Yeah.
And Colin Powell was the guy who took the information that was supplied to him by the CIA and by other intelligence agency and went in front of the UN and said, yeah, Saddam Hussein is not only producing weapons of mass destruction, but he's in cahoots with radical Islamic fundamentalist groups, both of which were absolute lies.
Right.
Absolute lies.
Right.
I thought his interview yesterday, by the way, when he said, they're doing it again. The same people who have been pounding the drums for another major conflagration in the Middle East are doing it again. They haven't stopped.
Right. Yeah, and inherent in, like, one of the most interesting contradictions for me now is part of our premise of, you know, after Saddam and staying in Iraq was nation building and helping to establish a democracy there, a sovereign entity. And now that they have voted to expel all U.S. troops, you would think, after all our years in country, that really to recognize that as a sovereign entity, we would be respectful of their democratic choice. So that strikes me as like a pretty severe irony.
There's a whole bunch of ironies, aren't there? I agree with you.
Yeah.
Another one is the very premise that Iraq could become a democratically based egalitarian society as opposed to a set of tribal sects who are at each other's throats. The idea that that was possible was just obscene on the surface. And now, lo and behold, it's like we've been infected by that. And the United States is drifting now away from being an egalitarian, democratically based kind of give and take democratic system to being two sets of tribes who hate each other. The irony is just, as you say, it's almost beyond belief.
Yeah, I had a moment at the gym the other morning where the ticker, it was like CNN was randomly on, which, you know, CNN, take it or leave it. I think they've been doing a better job throughout the impeachment, but they're pretty inflammatory as a news source sometimes. And it said, you know, the U.S. sending more troops to Iraq. And I just had this moment, I was like, I thought the 2000s were over. I thought the 2010s were over. It's just Groundhog Day.
What's the point of having the largest defense establishment on the planet, the most expensive by the order of magnitude? We spend more on defense, quote unquote. There's a great labeling process. We're spending money on defense. No, you're not. You're spending money on weapons and weapon systems to destroy people at a distance. That's what it is.
Right, and contractors to secure resources.
Exactly.
Yeah. Oh, it's just a tragedy.
What's the point of spending all that money, though, if you don't use it? Right?
Right. Do you remember, I think that the consensus generally is that MSNBC is more left-leaning as a network, and it's sort of, you know, the equivalent to Fox in some ways, except for on the political left. When do you remember that transition happening around the same time that Fox News started to emerge as a network like that, or did they exist in that space already? Because I haven't tracked that as well, and I think that's also interesting.
Yeah, I think that's an urban myth. I don't think that's true. I think MSNBC and NBC in general work pretty hard to be objective journalists. It's the same dilemma we have with this labeling of anybody who's against Trump as being Trump haters. Trump,
Or never Trumper.
never Trumpers, whatever. Yeah, however you want to call that. Trump has been breaking the law since before he was even elected. So I think what MSNBC does better than any other network is they report that. Where CNN gets caught is they try to do this kind of artificial
presenting two sides
yeah,
as
we're going to have
co-equal.
spoken from each side. And the spokesmen defending Trump are absolutely predictable. They talk shit. They obfuscate and they talk shit. It's crystal clear.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a false equivalency to say, well, as Fox News is on the left, on the right, MSNBC is on the right. Vice versa. I'm sorry. Left. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, I would argue though that I think you're right in part that their reporting is true. I think that they have more liberal like talking heads and pundits on MSNBC. They have fewer conservative commentators, which is fine and that's their prerogative. But yeah, I think it's a fair way to categorize them.
Yeah, we'll just have to disagree. I purposely watch CNN and occasionally I watch Fox News as well, and especially the guy, I'm blocking his name, the guy that just resigned from Fox News a little while ago, who was on at 1:00 in the afternoon. He's from Alabama. He was really a good dude, and they ran him off because he talked bullshit. He called out Trump for his lies, and he's gone now. They're going to do the same thing with Chris Wallace. He won't. He has such a presence that they can't get rid of him right away. But if you're an objective reporter of the absolute truth, you can't appear on Fox News. And I've seen on CNN where they'll bring somebody like Rick Santorum or one of the other apologists for Trump, and the CNN hosts just end up getting yelling matches with them because they lie, and then they lie some more, and they lie about stuff that's absolutely transparently true.
Right. I actually think that I've been pleased by some of those hosts sort of fact-checking and bantering back and forth, even though I agree, I don't think that the shouting is productive at all. But to me, it's better than, the head nod and allowing the person to finish. Like, I think I've seen Jake Tapper or even Andrew Cuomo, definitely Anderson Cooper in a couple of instances say, well, excuse me, that's just patently not true. And then the person will obfuscate and just sort of, talk their way around whatever that point is. But I do think, even though it does end in yelling matches often, it is more productive than just letting those things slide.
I agree.
Yeah.
And what's also interesting is if you went back and you tracked the last 3 plus 3.5 years, you watch the evolution where the hosts, male and female, on both CNN and MSNBC finally get to a point where they'll say, that's a lie.
Exactly. Yeah.
They wouldn't do it forever. Oh,
Right.
well, that's not quite, there's other people.
Part of my hope is that they are too fearful and ashamed to make the mistake of the first Iraq war again. I'm hoping that those journalists learned their lesson. I'm hoping that some of that has come into 2020 and reporting in 2020, but who knows? Or they're so incensed, by the president that, to prove a point about a storm hitting Alabama, draws a fake map with a fucking Sharpie.
Right.
This is the reality we're living in, and you have to say, no, that's actually not true.
Right.
Yeah.
Or a party led by a fraud and a con that says, we have to restrict abortion rights for women because all life is precious. And then they have upwards of 5,000 brown-skinned babies in dog cages.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Like what?
Aside from, there's just so many things, but yeah, women's rights, right to choose being restricted state by state, I think is another huge issue. But aside from the lives lost in the war overseas, I think the fact that there are still parents and children that have not been reunited, and it's just such gross negligence by our government that they separated those families without a plan to reunite them. Like, I think that's human rights abuses, and I don't think it's a radical thing to describe it as such. Right? I mean,
agree.
in what other, would we accept any other, like, think of if in North Korea, South Koreans somehow or people from Japan were trying to come over for a better life and they separated parents from children. We would call them animals. Terrorists, absolutely. And the fact that it's sort of, have amnesia and we've gone through all these news cycles, and because they're brown skinned and English isn't their first language, and we worship this man who has a golden toilet in his New York apartment who says he's a man of the people. It's just one of the most obscene and heartbreaking things. And it's like, okay, what do we do? Donate our money to the nonprofits that are fighting to reunite those families? That's irrevocable damage that we have caused. It's just insane. It's insane to me. I don't think did Bush do anything as heinous as that? I don't think so. I don't think anywhere close. The argument that the Obama administration was the one that instituted that rule, well, they didn't enforce it. And that's the huge difference here. You know, Jeff Sessions chose to, in April, I believe it was, start enforcing that as a means of deterrence. And they know that.
Yes.
And then, God forbid, that poor judge or the law professor who was testifying during the impeachment uses Barron's name as a noun or adjective. Yeah. I mean, not to go off
Well, the other thing,
topic, but it's
the other thing
it's
that's really
insanity.
interesting that gets no play at all that I can see on any of the major networks is the fact that in September, beginning in September, something that's called the repo market. So the way the United States government finances its expenditures is they sell treasury bonds on a market to what they call primary dealers. And in my lifetime, I'm 75 years old, in my lifetime, U.S. Treasury bills have been the go-to safe haven place to park money. Because you knew you're going to get your money back, you're going to get a decent return, and you get paid back in U.S. dollars, which have been the reserve currency of the world since 1945. What happened in September is that the people who would historically buy U.S. Treasury bills, including the Japanese, the Chinese, deep money pockets anywhere in the world, if they wanted to put aside a significant hunk of their money, they could always buy Treasury bills and put them away and know that they were backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. Suddenly, in September, the repo market started to dry up, and there weren't enough buyers for U.S. Treasury bills. So the buyers that stepped in was the Federal Reserve Bank. And what they did is they started creating money out of thin air, and they started buying U.S. government bonds in the repo market so the market wouldn't collapse. And since September through now, the first week in January, they have created enough money out of thin air that equals to the QE that was done in 2008.
Oh, wow.
That's how bad it is.
Wow. And I don't hear anyone reporting that.
Nobody's talking about it. Well, because we got Mr. Showtime, Mr. Fantasy.
Insulting dead senators and saying they're going to hell.
Reality show, The Orange Baboon,
Yeah.
who's taking us down.
The obese orange golfer.
And you're talking about ironies. So here's a man that's supported by conservative Republicans and conservative evangelicals.
The fact that Mike Pence is the VP Is there a new low that you could sink to for just being partisan? I mean, the man who apparently can't be alone in a room with a woman who isn't his wife, who calls his wife mother, who probably only does it missionary, if that.
You think he doesn't?
Is the VP to the adulterous hush money shithead?
I know.
Mike Pence is allergic to porn stars, probably.
And do you remember that little quip? Did you see that? It was yesterday. Mike Pence standing on the floor of the Congress declaring that the United States, back in, this was, 2004, the United States had found weapons of mass destruction.
Oh, yeah.
You remember that?
Yeah. Good job, Mike.
Oh, my God. I think I need a drink.
Sure.